Good morning, test. The nuclear war is not started. Good. With warming session first. Really?
We shouldn't do that now.
We do that first. We do that, so it's part of the presentation. It's part of the presentation. So better give me 10 minutes more, but then it's part of the presentation, which makes a lot more sense. So I've combined these slides from a set of slides that I typically use in Red Hat for new hire orientations. So if you see the Red Hat logo in there, don't be confused. This is not a Red Hat event. It's just that I am very recycling able with everything that I typically use. So introductory round is quite simple at this moment. Just, you know, this is the first round. We will have more detailed introduction later. Just very short, everybody goes through this, fill in the blanks, and the I care about part, you can effectively put whatever you want. This is really a community of your own. Communities are guided by some set of rules, and one of the fundamental rules is know who you are. No matter if you're physically here or remotely or whatever, but just make sure everybody knows who is who. So we'll go right here, you fill in the blanks, and then we go clockwise until we've reached me.
My name is Miguel Zapateras. I'm an ambassador at the project, and I care about open standards because it is important for our everyday life.
Very good. Next. Process you can imagine with lots of lobbying and etc. As we will have a social event, my typical reply to all of that is if you want to know more, give me So with that, we're switching to the history, just to make sure what, why, when. Installment of the slide is open. Kind of like the most fundamental crime you can do. And how to create it, say why. Wrote in 1985. Some very important stuff in here. About bridging the divide that try to create and to make sure that there is this more solidarity. Now, why did this installment do all of this? Technology, the MIT, in the AI lab. And he was a young guy, and he was one of the so-called long-term hackers. Of the professors, by lockpicking. Access to the office was a terminal that was connected to the time-sharing system, so you had some compute power. And that's where the term originally came from. Now, at that time at the MIT, Stallman was a very smart programmer, did a lot of smart stuff. And there are a lot of legends and myths around why he created free software. I just like this, and you can look it up. I'm not telling you. Network connected printers. First ever network connected printers. Now, if you go back to that time in the 80s, you remember printers with the Centronics plug, with big, giant 36-pin connectors. So we continue. Okay. So the Centronics has a lot of indication signals. One of them is and it still exists in the Linux kernel. If you look at the source code of the Linux kernel for printer on fire, you will find the command. And it actually is very good signal, because if you think about these giant printers that produce, your phone bill and all of this massive printing stuff, they do this at a very high speed, and if they have some problem with the paper, for example, and they are getting stuck, then this giant electrical component will immediately catch fire, because it immediately overheats and puts the printer on fire. And there was another signal line which would simply indicate a paper jam in the printer. This is all very basic stuff. Firmware of these network connections offer the signal paper jam, which was simply not existent in this programming. Now this is kind of stupid, because if you're at the MIT and you queue a print job and you come, good morning, no problem. Oh, that's simple. It's no problem, just fill in the blanks. Just go, read the sentence, fill in the blanks. See, perfect, just works. So I'll go back here. So these printers didn't offer the signal of paper jam. So you would file the print job, you would walk across the campus, get a coffee, and then talk to some people, and then finally you arrive at the printer room and boom, paper jam. So you remove the paper jam, go back, and do it again. Now this is what Richard Stallman didn't like. So he called up the guy at Xerox, the printer manufacturer, and said, please give me the source code of the firmware, because this function is missing and I don't want to bother you. You have enough work of yourself. I just want to add this function, and then you can get it from me, you can reuse it, no problem. Because that was the way software was written back in the time. Remember, there was no software market at that time. It was just starting. At that time, software was considered a piece of the whole thing. you buy hardware, and in the hardware package is a little piece of software, but it was not a separate product. It was not a line item on your bill, and etc. That came after that. So the guy at Xerox said, yeah, well, Richard, we know each other for a long time, and you know, it's cool, it's no problem, but I have signed an NDA. I'm not allowed to give you the source code. And Richard was like, what? No source code? Whoa, something is fundamentally changing. So Richard, you know, went into the desert for 40 days, praying to the gods of computer and Unix and etc., and said something is fundamentally wrong. Now, if Richard gets into the state where he thinks something is fundamentally wrong, you know, you're in dangerous waters. It's really getting hardcore. So he came back with this fundamental idea about software freedom, because we need a system that ensures software freedom, and we need to make it appealing to the people, so we create the whole thing. Richard is not a guy of small stuff, so he said, let's recreate Unix completely from scratch as free software. So he defined free software, the free software license, the GNU General Public License, the Free Software Foundation, and started the GNU project, where GNU means GNU is not Unix. So they wanted to recreate everything from scratch. They already had quite a lot then, you know, the compiler, the editor. So the first free software project ever written was, of course, an editor. So that's the most important thing you need, and it was Emacs. Now, at that time, we used to say Emacs, you know, we're going back to beginning of the 90s. At that time, we, with our 386 computers, we used to say Emacs is an acronym for 8 megabytes and constantly swapping, because that was effectively what it did. But it's not really true. Emacs effectively means editor macros. So don't ask how you come from editor macros to Emacs. That's a special thing of Richard. And the second thing then was, because Richard normally creates software that is completely bug-free, you know, he's a programming guru, but sometimes there are bugs in there. So the next free software project was the GDB, the GNU debugger, and the GDB was effectively written to debug Emacs. And all of it that's doing nowadays, of course, system development, if you work with GNU toolchain and you use GDB a lot, you use it for C, for every other language, but it originally started to debug an editor. That's what I always like about all of this. So in 1985 he started all of this, and he called it free software. Now the problem was that in English language, the term free means a lot of things. Many people misunderstood it as free means no cost. That's not what it was about. It's also free software. At that time, we were shipping QIC tapes across the planet. So if you wanted to have the source get the cartridge, the source code on the cartridge. So it really was not about free in that sense, but more about freedom. And that's what caused them a lot of problems. So with that, we have fundamentally explained free software, and this term free software then became open source because of people saying, you know, we need to market it in a different way, which immediately brings me then to open standards as the second most important building sector. And that was effectively created by Tim Berners-Lee. Now, Tim Berners-Lee can be considered the creator of the internet as normal people think about it. You know, if you ask someone on the street what is internet, then he will typically point you to whatever website that runs HTTP, HTML, etc. And that's what Tim Berners-Lee created. But in creating that already at the CERN in Geneva, in Europe, he already said, you know, he saw a fundamental problem. At that time, computer networks that existed were stuff like AOL, CompuServe, and all that stuff. Anybody here who remembers CompuServe? You know, the CompuServe discussion groups and all of that stupid stuff. Now, the interesting part of CompuServe and everything around it is it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. So we had millions and millions of postings and discussions in CompuServe, but because it was a walled garden managed by one single company, after that company sold itself to another company, it was gone. And Tim Berners-Lee wanted to make sure that that never happens. So he created a set of rules that made sure it became an open system. So for HTTP and HTML, he said there must be absolute freedom So even if it becomes an ISO standard, the standard text must be available for free at any time to anyone. Anyone must be allowed to implement it without asking for permission, and anybody must be allowed to use it without having to pay money or asking for permission. Now these three fundamental rules created or codified a system we now call open standards, and that's becoming the most important part after open source right now. Open standards allow this to be created. Without open standards, the web wouldn't exist and a lot of open source wouldn't exist. So right now we're having this discussion in Brussels, you know, I'm lobbying a lot in Brussels about ODF versus Microsoft Office. And ODF is an open standard and Microsoft's Ooxml is a big catastrophe but not an open standard. So making that difference clear is very important. So he said, it's not enough if I believe in that, it must make sure that it will always be like that, even if I don't exist any longer. So he created the W3C, which is a governing organization, just as the Free Software Foundation does it for free software. The W3C cares about all these standards. Nowadays, a lot of them, by the way. It's XML, it's HTTP, HTML, and I guess there's something like 100 and something working groups in W3C governing various parts of open information exchange. So we now have fundamentally open source, we have fundamentally open standards, and the third thing in the three big O's then is open content. And open content is created by this guy, Lawrence Lessig. Lawrence Lessig created something called Creative Commons, and as free software, which I will explain in a minute, sort of abuses the copyright system to use the system that exists to guarantee effectively the opposite of what the system was created for. You know, we use the copyright system to guarantee freedom, and this is what Lawrence Lessig does for content of whatever kind. You know, no matter if it's street maps or music or works of art, all of the stuff where usual free software licensing doesn't really work, think Wikipedia and all of that stuff, is governed by Creative Commons rules. Now, he had this very, very famous presentation about free culture, something like 8-9 years ago, which you can still find on the internet. And it's a 30 minutes presentation, and you really should look at it because it's a lot of fun to watch it, but it also tells you how fundamentally wrong some things are in society right now. So he says, remember the refrain, we always build on the past. Everything we do is built on what people before us have done. Nobody invents something fundamentally new that hasn't existed before. This is normal human thinking process. The past always tries to stop us by using fundamentally flawed rules like the abuse of the copyright system. You know, right now, you all know this with MPA, REA, etc., you know, suing little children for sharing music is for sure not really helping in understanding how the system works. Freedom is about stopping the past, but we have lost that. And with that in mind, look at the facts. And fact is that we have a lot of data from the 16th, 17th, 18th century available in museums, in archives, public open archives, but we have already lost the data in software programs from the 90s. It's locked up in proprietary silos. We cannot attach to it anymore. Every university that does some sort of research knows this. You know, the raw data of research, no matter if in biology or in physics or whatever, is existent on whatever tape or whatever archive, but you cannot reuse the information. Now, information that cannot be reused is dead information. It's toxic waste, digital toxic waste sitting there, and you cannot work with it any longer. So trying to make that work again is then the task of open content. And with that, we have everything complete. So we know how to work with the stuff, we know how to distribute it, and we know how to protect it from being occupied and monopolized in the wrong way. And then, of course, we have this famous young man. This is Linus Torvalds. At the moment, he wrote the first thing that later became the Linux kernel, which was the only missing part for Richard Stallman's GNU project. So the GNU project had everything, compilers, editors, system libraries, but they were working on a kernel called the HURD, H-U-R-D, and they're still working on the kernel called the HURD, and it still hurts a lot to run the HURD because it doesn't really work. And then this guy comes along and he didn't want to write a kernel. That was not his job. The only thing he wanted, he was saving a lot of money and lending money from people to buy a 386 computer, an Intel 386 based machine, to play with the different operation modes of the CPU. Because it has the real mode, it has the extended mode, and all that stuff. And he wanted to play with that. So the first thing he wrote, and that's where he opened this bottle of beer, was a process scheduler. Now, not even that, it was just a process switcher. So you had two processes. One would write A on the screen, and the other one would write B on the screen. And his process switcher could then switch between these two processes. And the screen was filling with AAA, BBB, AAA, and he was really proud. He thought he is now the king of the world and he can get all the girls at university and etc. It didn't really work out that way. But after doing that, he then was thinking, what's the next step? And he was working with Minix at that time. So this is also the news group, Compo as Minix. Now Minix was created by Professor Andrew Tannenbaum of the Free University of Amsterdam. To teach the students how to create POSIX compatible or compliant operating systems from scratch. Now Minix had its flaws because it was really meant to do just that. It was not a full-blown operating system, but he was using Minix to compile his stuff. So he then asked around in the news groups that already existed at that time, I want to do something that is more POSIX compatible. Can someone please send me the Posix Specification? Now the Posix Specification is a sort of an open standard, but it's very expensive to buy. At that time it was $600 to buy the printed pages of the Posix Specification. So another famous guy, John Maddock Hall, guy with a long beard, John Maddock Hall, working at Digital at that time, he sent him a not very legal copy because John was working at DEC, so Digital Equipment Corporation at that time. So he sent him a copy of the Posix Specification, and that got Linus Torvalds to make more out of this, and this eventually became a real complete kernel. Now at Red Hat we still have posters of this original kernel version, version 001 of the Linux kernel, and we give that to students that come to our trainings and etc. And this poster right now is in the heart of a discussion because somebody a few months ago patched the original sources of the very first kernel to be able to compile with the newer versions of the GNU C compiler because it didn't compile. And so now it's patched, and now the question is, now we have this fundamental discussion in Red Hat. What are we going to ship to our students? The original version, because that's the history, or the patched version, because we care about upstream compatibility? So right now I'm discussing with the marketing department. It will be a little bit more expensive. I said we should send it as a unified diff. So the original source with the diff in there, what you need to change in the second color. But he then published this on Compo as Minix and said, I'm doing this kernel thingy, and because everything of GNU is already out there, we can immediately jumpstart and kick into that. And that's how Linux was created. But he didn't call it Linux. He called it Freaks for whatever stupid reason that nobody understands. So he created a directory on the FTP server of university called Freaks and put in the source codes there. And then the FTP administrator said, that's a stupid name. And you are Linus Torvalds, so I call it Linux. It sounds better. And that's how the name Linux was invented, which brings me to the three fundamental theories of ICT. It all happened by accident. It was done by amateurs, and nothing's really changed. It still works exactly like that. If you look at the Oracles and Microsoft of the world, it just works. Now, and with that in mind, then this whole system started rolling. So nowadays we have 100,000 plus open source projects out there. Everybody, first thing, there is no open source community. That's fundamentally wrong to talk about the open source community. What we have is 100,000 communities, each with their own politics. And trust me, they are very different. So some parts, the kernel is effectively a dictatorship model where Linus Torvalds is the benevolent dictator who has the fundamental final say, but he doesn't really use that right very often. Other communities work with completely different government models. And it's our task at Fedora mainly to integrate all of that in a way we can create a distribution that ultimately leads then to the commercial products of Red Hat, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. But to combine all of these different policies, these different governing stuff and etc. into a working distribution. So in Fedora, we have this fundamental cultural task to integrate all of that in a working way and to find the best tools for that, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about here. Because what you are doing at universities is effectively similar to that. You have lots of different projects, lots of different students, lots of different policies to care about, and you are trying to integrate that in a way that hopefully works good. Now, we are here to let you participate on how we have done that in the open source world, and then see how it connects and what we can learn from each other. And it's not a teaching session here. It's not about us telling you how it must be done. It's about us listening to what you are doing and then giving a little bit of advice, from our world, what can maybe be reused in your context, and then let's talk about it for a long time. Also, the next years and etc. Keep the process running, because the most important thing in open source development is having working feedback cycles. It doesn't help to start somewhere and then say, okay, now it's going to work, because it never works. You have to be there, you have to be enthusiastic about this, and that's why my presentation was all about these people, because it's people who do the hard work. Now, we have to talk about a little bit of boring stuff, which is legally and etc., but I'll make it very fast and very short. So what is free and open source software, and more specifically, what's the difference between free and open source? Because everybody talks about it like it's the same, and it isn't. Fundamentally, there is a difference. So free software, in the most simple way, is defined by the Free Software Foundation. The Free Software Foundation cares about the 4 fundamental freedoms that we will go through. Open source is defined by the Open Source Initiative, which was created by Eric S. Raymond and Mr. what's his name again? From HP, etc., etc., etc. Bruce Perens. So Bruce Perens, and they created the open source definition because at that time the fundamental principle of free software was widely accepted. Everybody said free software is a good way to develop software. However, the person, Richard Stallman, was painted by a lot of people like he's a socialist, he's a communist, he's a weird guy, he's crazy, and yes, he is. Don't get me wrong, he's a very, very smart person, but he has his annoyances. He can sit in front of 500 people and start cleaning his toenails. He does that. You don't want to have such a person explaining to a big company that wants to invest millions and millions of dollars. You don't want to have that guy. So that's why Bruce Perens and Eric Raymond said we need to have another term that effectively expresses the same thing but in a different way, and that's open source. So they created the Open Source Initiative, which effectively is a sort of rubber stamp organization for open source licenses. Unfortunately, they could do a lot more. Right now they're on the way back to do a lot more. And the definitions have a fundamental little difference that is the reason for the holy war in open source and free software between the two. But it's really important to know about this because especially if you are going to ask for research grants in the future, you will come exactly to this very important point. So they agree on the most important things, the freedom to copy, and before the freedom to copy comes another freedom, which is obvious to many people, but not reality, the freedom to use software. That's freedom 0, the freedom to use software. Now, you might think that every software can be used, but it's not the case. Think about Microsoft Windows. If you don't have this artificial thing called a license and registered and etc., you're not allowed to use Windows. Free software can be used everywhere by anyone at any time. So the freedom to copy, which means everyone is free to copy it as many times as he wants and redistribute it. The freedom to make derivative works, so take what is there, make changes to it for whatever reason, and then again redistribute the changed version. So free software and open source agree on all of these, but here the redistribution is where the little difference kicks in. Free software is very hardcore about redistribution rights. Free software says if you redistribute, you must do it under the same license terms or compatible license terms, but you cannot change the license in redistribution, where open source says we don't care too much about that. Now that's a fundamental reason why Apple and Microsoft and Oracle love open source that way, where they have here in the redistribution right more freedom, and that's why they hate free software and the GPL. And that's why we at Red Hat, we love the GPL and we don't like the BSD licenses so much, because we want to make sure that this commons that has been created can be extended. The only reason Red Hat exists is because other people have done a lot of work. So we need to give back by, paying developers, by making all of our software free software, and be there whenever it's needed. On the other hand, however, the Microsoft and the Apple says, okay, we gladly use it because it saves us development and engineering costs, but we don't care about giving back. That's none of our problems. So with that in mind, we have to talk a little bit about how does it all work. Now this goes back again to 1980, 1990, where we had this fundamental decision on what governs software. Now this might sound like a stupid topic to talk about, but it was really important at that time. Now I'm talking about the GATT agreement, the Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, where for the first time in history, all countries in the world decided on how to protect copyright and patents and trademarks and etc., and how to have them unified in a way that works. At that time, it was fundamentally decided that software should be covered by copyright and only by copyright. There was a discussion because software is not a piece of literature. It's not a book. It's not a song or whatever. So it's not a natural fit for copyright. So people were claiming at that time software is typically used only in industrial settings. So it should be patentable and it was decided it should become copyright and only copyright. Now if we talk about copyright, there is a scale of freedom. And on the one side of the scale, at all. Trade secrets. So here is Coca-Cola, etc., blah, blah, blah. They treat their knowledge as trade secrets protected by copyright. If you get a copy of the Coca-Cola recipe, they can force you to not publish it based on the rights and copyright. On the other side of the scale, a concept where no rights exist anymore called the public domain. Now be very careful. The domain is a concept that everybody in the US, but for example in Europe, it doesn't exist in that way. In the US, you can give up your copyright and make something public domain. You as the author are free to do that. In Europe, all legislations that are based on the French Revolution, there is a concept called the droit d'auteur, the right of the author, that does not allow you to give up your copyright. It's not possible to give up your copyright. However, it automatically can. Right now, 70 years after the death of the author, his works become released to the public domain, become part of the commons. But you can't cross it there. In the US, you can. There is another fundamental difference. In the US, you can transfer the complete copyright between people and organizations. This is what you see in every contract with American companies, that all your base belongs to us. Whatever you think about becomes part of the company, and the company can use and reuse it. This is also not possible in European French Revolution-based judiciary systems, because we have this droit d'auteur, which means I can give licenses for the stuff, but I cannot transfer the copyright itself. It's always bound to a natural person. And I like when the American people don't. So that's okay. But you need to keep in mind, you cannot give up the copyright under the European style legislation. I don't know how the situation in South Africa is directly, but I guess it's more this European droit d'auteur thing and not the transfer of copyright. But that's up to a legal expert to decide. Don't get me wrong on this. Now, on this scale from all rights relinquished to all rights retained, this is where licensing lives. Now, the more you use the rights in copyright, the rights that you get offered, the closer you're moving in this direction, which means proprietary licenses are very close to trade secrets. Protective open source licensing, this is the GPL world. This is my world, because this is what I fundamentally believe in. This is free software, lives here in that range. We use a lot of the rights in copyright to protect the freedom of the software and the works we've created. Now, a little bit closer to here are the non-protective open source licenses. This is the BSDs, the Apache licenses, the MPLs, and etc. That use a little less of these rights. And that's why there is this fundamental holy war between BSD and GPL. because the BSD people say, you know, we offer more freedom based on the rights in copyright. They're right. They offer more freedom. And we say, the GPL world says, yes, but we have to use these rights to defend the fundamental freedom that we care about. And that's why there is this holy war between protective and non-protective, and it will never be solved. So don't go into these discussions, you know, they're useless. It's okay to have fun with that, but you will never be able to solve it. It's a fundamental difference on, do we want to use these rights to protect the freedom, or do we consider using these rights less freedom? Now this is a question nobody can sort out. So with this fundamental scale of freedom and offering freedom and granting freedom through licensing, the software industry was created, maintained, and made successful over the last 30, 40 years. And it was a wonderful system. It worked. However, over the past few years, something crept into our system that causes us big problems and big pains. And that is, as I said, it was fundamentally decided that copyright and copyright only should govern software. But this is being turned around by patent lawyers. And now we have this fundamental problem of software patents. And to make things worse, these lawyers that are smart people and they're lobbyists, they use a term called intellectual property, which is fundamentally wrong. You know, intellectual property is saying we put everything in one big bowl, stir it, and then hope it somehow works. Every time I'm lobbying and etc., and somebody talks about the protection of intellectual property, I always ask, what are you talking about? Are you talking about patents? Are you talking about trademarks? Or are you talking about copyright? Because these three systems are fundamentally different. A patent, once granted, lasts for 20 years and then it becomes public domain, period. Copyright lasts for 70 years after the death of the primary author, so they're definitely not comparable. Trademarks is even a complete different story. So software patents are now threatening open source and free software, and that's why Red Hat as a company has made it a big point, and we published that a week ago in writing for the first time ever, and I'm very proud of the fact that we say we think software patents should be abolished completely. They're wrong, they hinder innovation, they are overly broad, they don't work the way it should work. I'm not against the patent system, don't get me wrong. You know, the fundamental idea of the patent system, which is a deal with society in exchange for a full disclosure of your invention or creation, you get a limited monopoly to make money out of that, but it's still your task to make the money. This fundamental deal with society is a good thing, but it's not how the patent system works nowadays. And that's the fundamental problem. And in software it gets even worse. So if you apply for a patent, it will take you round about, right now, 4 to 5 years to get it granted, which in software means 3-4 complete product cycles. So you're not protecting something new. Effectively, you're putting extortion mechanisms in place for something that other people are also doing. So that's why we are fundamentally against software patents. However, we have to accept that they exist. Is simple reality. So Red Hat is filing software patents of themselves, but we also invest in groups like Open Invention Network, which is a group we created that buys patents to build up a defense arsenal to use. You know, defensive patenting, totally weird. So right now you can imagine the whole market is closely looking at what's going to happen to Novell. You know, Novell supposedly going to be split up. The SUSE Linux part goes to VMware, and the other parts go to a company that nobody knows of called AttachMate. And we are strongly suspecting that some group of patent trolls is behind that to buy the patents from Novell and then start suing the rest of the world. This is business risk that we have to cope with, and you should be aware that it exists. And there are ways to work with patents that are not that dangerous. So we have a patent promise. Every patent that Red Hat files is always completely free for anyone who produces open source software according to the definitions of the open source initiative. But that doesn't mean that Microsoft can use our patents. But we have never sued anyone for patent infringement. We're seeing how Microsoft is running around now to everyone who produces Android phones and says, Android phones are violating some of our patents. We will not tell you which, and we will not tell you why, but they're doing it. Pay us money. You know, it reminds me of these movies, you know, the Godfather and etc., where people are standing in front of Italian restaurants. If you want to run your restaurant, you have to pay us every month a little bit of money to keep it quiet. This way that patents are working is wrong, and we oppose it fundamentally. Now, that was the part that was boring about licensing. Now open standards and open source, how do they play together? Fact is, our software market as it exists right now is fundamentally broken because interoperability, which is the most important topic right now, is right now a one-to-one model. So if somebody says SAP and Microsoft must be interoperable, SAP and Microsoft create something that you don't know what it is, and somehow your data now starts traveling around. The problem is that over time it becomes a spider web of contracts and intelligence deals and this and that and patent license agreements and all of that. And if you're here, you're a smart startup company or an open source group or a university, and you have something that is good and you want to enter here and to become certified and etc., you have to talk to all of these companies and all of these different NDAs and whatever agreements. So effectively it takes you a lot of money. So they have created a closed market system where you cannot tap into. And this is a problem that everybody knows about, but nobody really sees it. However, there is a solution to that, and that's open standards. Because with open standards, I break up this relationship in the middle. If I force everyone to use a open standard, no matter which one it is, could be ODF or HTTP or whatever, but if there is an open standard and SAP implements the open standard and Microsoft implements the open standard, first of all, they are still operable. They can still interoperate with each other. However, I can now verify it on this level independently. I don't have to ask for permission because it's an open standard. And that's why open standards are so fundamentally important, because they create a level playing field in the market and outside the market to be able to work with. And this is what we do, by the way. So for ODF, for the open document format, we've created hackathons. Now we as a group in Brussels that care a lot about the policy level. So we created hackathons where we do one simple thing. We invite all projects that implement and work with ODF, with the open document format in whatever way, present them with interoperability problems. So simple thing, we take a calculation sheet in OpenOffice, in OpenOffice Calc. We send it to Google Docs, and then Google Docs saves it again. Then we send it to K-Office, and then K-Office puts it. Then we put it in Microsoft Office, and Microsoft Office saves it again as ODF, and then we try to open it again in OpenOffice, and it typically never works. Now this round trip doesn't work. So that's what we do. We get these people together in one room, present them with real-world problems, have people from the standardization organization, in this case OASIS, and let them sort out the problems right there so that we can get better implementation of open standards. And even Microsoft agrees on that, which is a good thing. They always come. They send their developers to work with us on real-world problems. So with that in mind, you can do open standards in good and bad ways. So this is Microsoft's Ooxml. This is the printed version of Ooxml. It's right now 7,228 pages of specification. It's 2,300 corrections that are worked in there, but there is still not a corrected standard document. You still have to download the normal documents plus the corrections, and then you have to sit there for 3 days to transfer that into the document. There is no corrected version available. Ooxml, no matter what Microsoft claims, is not implemented at all by any product. There is not a single product out there, not even Microsoft Office, that can produce Ooxml as it is agreed by ISO, which is ridiculous. So what Microsoft produces right now is ECMA 376 compatible sortish stuff, where ECMA 376 is a completely broken standard, which even Microsoft gladly admits. And the convener of ISO that managed the whole process says, yeah, but that's not why we created Ooxml. It's just to convert legacy documents into a bright, shiny new future. This is totally wrong. So ODF 1.2, on the other hand, is 700 pages and just works. So governments right now all across the planet are asking, what can we do here? And this is then another point of open source and how it works. Right now, OpenOffice and lots of the work on ODF is now being owned after they bought Sun by Oracle. And many people don't trust Oracle. So we were sitting there together with a lot of people over the last months. And last week, I guess you've all heard about the announcement, we announced the creation of the Document Foundation and a fork of OpenOffice called LibreOffice. And we, in this case, is not only the vendors, companies like Novell and Red Hat and Google and IBM and etc., but users. The government of Brazil, the The government groups here in South Africa are also playing a big part in that. And I think that is important, and that shows you what the true power of open source is. If something goes in a fundamentally wrong direction, you can always fork and do it a better way. But you have to be careful. Forking is a very expensive operation. You know, trying to convince the old community to move to your new one, this is not a decision you take like this. You always have forks because there are always people, you know, open source consists of a lot of people with very individual ways of thinking. So you typically have for each big project a lot of small forks that nobody really cares about. But here we're trying to do a big fork. And doing that is a tough thing. And if you want to see the dynamics of open source and community and etc. in action, follow what's happening with LibreOffice and the Document Foundation, because it's going to be a prime example, no matter if it works or if it doesn't work, but you can learn a lot from the process that we're following there. And with that, I'm effectively almost done. So one example of how to do that is the Netherlands, my home country. So the Netherlands have decided to completely switch everything in government to open standards, not everything to open source. That's step 2. First open standards, and once you have open standards, open source can compete in a level playing field. It doesn't work the other way around. Open source is not magic dust that you put over whatever stuff and suddenly everything is working. First you need to define how to interact. And interoperability between open source projects is a problem of its own, and it's exactly the same as in commercial software. There's no difference there. But as soon as we agree on open standards and we have a level playing field based on open standards, things start working and rolling into place. And this is what countries like Brazil are seeing. So Brazil is completely switching to ODF, and in their Java world they're now completely switching to OpenJDK. They're going to throw out the Sun JDK and all the Oracle stuff and completely switch to everything that is 100% pure open source. And why? Because the open standards exist. And they can verify if it works or not. And they don't have to ask for permission. So the Netherlands make this a complete program. And they're already threatened by Microsoft and the lobbyists, of course, that this is violating the rules of free trade. So they want to sue us in front of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, because we are discriminating against market participants. And I was sitting there and yeah, it's wonderful. You know, I was sitting there with this guy from Microsoft in this public panel discussion, and he said, yeah, you know, if you prescribe, if you want free software everywhere and you put it in your document that free software is a requirement for public tendering, you know, that's against the free market and everything. And I was starting to laugh, you know, really on stage. I was like, so this moderator took the microphone and said, Mr. Wildeboer, why are you laughing that much? And I said, well, you know, I find it quite funny that a representative of a company that was forced to pay 1.4 billion euros in fines for anti-competitive behavior in the European market, that this guy tries to explain to me how a free market should work. You know, this is really ridiculous. So we have a lot of fun in that discussion, you can trust me. Again, that is social event, 3 beers, and then talk about it. Conclusion is, interoperability based on open standards is a good thing because open standards create a level playing field with a low entry barrier. A low entry barrier means more open source. You know, that's the wonderful thing. If you go back to this picture, you know, if you go back to this picture with lots of participants and etc., and turn it to this with open standards, what you will see is there are a lot of small participants in that market. And over time, these commercial companies will see that it doesn't really work if everybody creates its own stack, because that's very expensive. So these small groups will combine with each other to create a combined stack using strict open source licensing like GPL. So nobody has a competitive advantage to create a unified stack. This is what happened in the Java world with OpenJDK. This is what's now happening with ODF and the ODF toolkit. This is exactly what happened in development with Eclipse. You know, that's why IBM donated Eclipse to the open source free software world to make it a de facto standard where everybody works on. And this fundamental principle creates more open source. And if you have more open source, then of course we will win. Now, there are obstacles on that way, but we won't go through all of them. You know, just in closing, see, Linus Torvalds nowadays looks a little bit better, and he joined the family of proud beer belly owners. You know, living in Munich as I am, you know, for sure. I fully understand that part. But he is still the maintainer of the Linux kernel. He is still in charge of everything. But but he doesn't do everything. He has a system where people more downstairs in a sort of hierarchy, it's not a real hierarchy, they are free to decide whatever stuff, and if something goes fundamentally wrong, he will step up and correct it according to what he thinks is best. But he is not driven by financial motivations or whatever. He works at the Linux Foundation, he gets his money, he gets his stuff done, he can care about his kids, and he still does a wonderful job at maintaining the Linux kernel, allowing companies like Red Hat to make a lot of money, employ a lot of developers and engineers, which is a good thing, and create this whole market and make it sustainable. So open source as a development model is not a discussion any longer, and I think this is something that many people, especially in academics, should really think about a little bit more often, especially in Germany. I talk to these people, and I'm brutally honest about everything. So I proposed to the European Commission in Brussels that we should rename all computer science universities in Europe to Microsoft Gold reseller partners, because that's effectively what they're doing. They're not teaching computer science as they should. They show them toolkits that exist that they do not maintain or co-create or have any influence on, and they're just reselling stuff of other people. Sun pioneered this years ago. This is how Sun got big. They gave Solaris boxes to universities for free, effectively, for years and years, and then these people come out of university and they want to have the same stuff, so they could sell stuff. Now, I propose the same system for open source. Use more open source principles, use more open source methods, and that's why we're sitting here for this week. Because then you get the control back that you had to give up to a lot of not only proprietary vendors, but to a lot of organizations and etc. that you don't want to. You are smart people, your students are smart people, and we can show them other methods to work together. And I think that's the most important part. And it's really not about you going out here and create lots of open source projects. We have enough open source projects already. There's more than 100,000 here. We can do something more. That's no problem. But as soon as the feedback cycle starts working, because you know how to use these university settings, you know how to use these open source settings, that's where we can get better collaboration and more results out of it. And if that's the task that we accomplish this week, I will be extremely proud of all of us. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know. So the simple things, when I studied computer science, which is a long time ago, but we really have to do the mathematical stuff behind it. So why is quicksort faster than bubble sort? So we really have to implement a program. Nowadays, people just use libraries and say, okay, sort this stuff. And they don't really know, so they still learn, of course, how quicksort works and why it is better and blah, 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 blah. But they don't know if their computers are actually using that or something completely different. And that dumbs down development. And I always say, if you use stupid systems, you can only expect stupid results. And if you want to do smart stuff, you have to invest more. If you want to do the stupid stuff, it's very simple to do that. If you want to do smart stuff, it needs a little bit more brain and a little bit more work. But it pays off. It gives you better results. And that's why, in Linux world and in open source world, etc., we're continuously asking ourselves, is it really the best way to do it? And if we only think about that, we always create alternatives. And then maybe we can also do whatever way. But try to ask for Microsoft better layer. Say, and to fix that, how it could work better. And that's what we want to discuss. So if you want to contact me or see me, I'm everywhere. So email, Facebook, Sing, LinkedIn, Small World, Twitter, Identica, bloody-daddy-daddy. Look for this picture with Red Hat. And with that, I'm done with my primary introduction. Now we will have 5 minutes water break, I guess, bio break. Yep, because at least I'm thirsty. So thanks for listening, and don't be too overwhelmed. Start ask questions, torture us. But now I need something to drink first, and a cigarette.